Welcome to Freedom and Glory, Tales of American Spirit, where every flag tells a story, and so does every person who raises one. Join Liz Morris and Bill Lumet for conversations with people making a difference in their communities, reminding us that even the smallest actions can spark lasting change.
Welcome to Tales of American Spirit. I'm Liz Morris, and if you've been with us for a while, you know what the show's about. It's based on the analogy of a drop of dye in a bucket of water, where we go looking for people whose small actions create a lasting change. So I'm really excited for today's episode. It's a little different. We've got Kelly Arnold here, and America turns 250 years this year. And I think we're going to hear a story told 100 different ways, mostly focused on Boston and Philadelphia. And so we wanted to do something a little different where we tell the story right from where we sit. So Freedom and Glory is based in Hillsborough, North Carolina. And some of the earliest steps towards independence happen a few minutes from our door. So like I said, we've got Kelly here. Thank you so much for joining us. Kelly's from the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough. And we're going to talk about a month in 1775 when the small town quietly went about building a country.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator with the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough. So the biggest thing that we do is help run the Visitor Center. So I get the absolute honor of sort of being the first point of contact for a lot of folks that are making their way into town for the first time and are sort of trying to understand what this town is about. We have a lot of signs on the highway that say Historic Hillsborough. Sometimes folks come in sort of looking for like an old Salem type experience where you get to go into all the houses and people are sort of dressed up in costume, which would be super fun, but is not generally what Hillsborough has. But we do have a lot of history, and the Visitor Center since literally steps away from the Regulator marker and from the plot of land where the Third Provincial Congress, which we're going to be talking about, is. So we're in a really unique position to be able to kind of be that first touchstone for a lot of folks.
Yeah. That would be amazing if you all dressed up.
It would be.
I love a theme party.
Yeah, it would be a lot of fun. We do sometimes. I mean, it depends. It's like our Revolutionary War Living History Day. Every once in a while, you'll catch us in it. I think for the 4th of July, like the town is doing a big celebration, and I've heard that our weekend staff member is going to dress up for it. So I don't know. You'll have to hold her to that.
Yes.
But
Hey, that's a cliffhanger.
Exactly.
I know. Yeah.
For the next podcast.
Yeah.
Well, so we're going to go back in time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So will you talk to us about what Hillsborough was like in the 1770s?
Yeah. So we have a map. We're kind of unique in being a town that has a map from 1768. It's called the Sauthier map that really shows exactly how the town was laid out. What I think is really interesting about it, a lot of the streets are laid out exactly the same way that you see on the map during that day. So some of the main buildings that are marked, the church, the courthouse, the jail, and the marketplace. Those are things that all towns would have had. But I think what's really unique about Hillsborough is that in our downtown area, a lot of those places are still in the exact same spots. So Hillsborough was a small town at the time, though. There's only a few different houses that are actually shown on it and a few shops and things like that. People were required to build mansion houses, which sound really big and stately, but they really had to be like 2 rooms and either made out of wood or brick, just so they were a little bit more substantial. But all of those would have really been mainly based off of King and Churton streets, which were the main streets at the time and sort of still are today.
Sure.
Yeah, the biggest thing is that we were right next to the Eno River. The reason that we were there is because it was the safest place to ford the river, so the easiest path to get across for travel. Previously, there had been like an Occaneechi settlement there, which was the local indigenous folks who lived in the area. They had also sort of set up along this area, and we were along the Great Trading Path, which was the main road that led through town and sort of forded the river at that spot. So that's sort of why Hillsborough was sort of nestled where it was at the time.
For me, one of the things, I'll be honest, it's a little embarrassing. I flunked history my first time through. I had to take it again. I wasn't a big fan. but I grew to love it. And coming from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and when the family come to visit, they say the same thing. There's so much history here.
Yeah.
I can't believe, the Civil War happened. I can't believe the background. But then to find out Hillsborough and what a predominant role it made in who we are today is phenomenal. Do you mind? How did Hillsborough get in that position? How is that possible?
So in 1754, it was laid out. And really shortly after that, you start to sort of have folks who are from the British colonial government. So at the time, they would have been sort of officers of the crown. They are sort of tasked with coming out and settling in Hillsborough. It was sort of the western seat of the British colonial power at the time. So why Hillsborough as opposed to, Salisbury just down the road, I really think is because of that connection to the river and along the trading path. But sort of as Hillsborough is growing up, it's always intended to be this sort of close connection to the British power of the time period. So you get a lot of officials who start settling in towns who have kind of the capital and the means to create these bigger houses, who are sort of the people who are going to be able to and have interest in, shopping in these general stores and things like that are springing up in town, and who are doing business in places like the courthouse and the jail and the marketplace, because those are sort of the official centers of power. So it sort of starts to become a magnet for folks who are involved in the government in the way that most folks who are, as far from the coast, which is traditionally where our centers of power are. That's why you get your Bostons that are like right on the harbor. Traditionally, folks who are settled a little bit further away, they would be very disconnected from sort of the goings on of like the king and the people that he's involved in. So Hillsborough starts to draw people in that want to be involved in that.
Can I just follow up? What kind of people lived there at that time? Were they... You said there was a close connection to, obviously, the king, but what kind of people were they? Sound very independent on the other hand. You have to be, right?
Some for sure. I think in the town, it's interesting. There's kind of a distinction between the folks who are living in the actual physical town of Hillsborough, which probably would have been designated as a pretty small section. So a lot of those folks would have been lawyers, would have been judges. Edmund Fanning is like one of the ones. He's the clerk of courts. He's sort of a well-known figure in town. You also have folks like Francis Nash, who goes on to sort of become a general in the American Revolution. These are the folks that are kind of seen living in town, especially. Also merchants and things like that are sort of running these shops. And then, of course, their families and the people that they have serving them, whether they were enslaved or sort of indentured and bonded. That would have been made up the core of town. But sort of just outside of Hillsborough, you do have some large homes like Moorfields that are sort of springing up as these large country estates. But for the most part, outside of that, you have sort of these subsistence farmers that are just kind of living off the land in the vast space that was Orange County at the time. Hillsborough was that county seat for all of Orange County, but it stretched all the way out to Guilford, to Greensboro, where Greensboro is today. So a lot smaller than what we normally think of as sort of Orange County today, which is just Chapel Hill and Hillsborough and Carrboro, basically. So that was kind of the difference between in town and out of town, I guess.
I love when you said that it was the furthest west.
Yeah.
That's just so wild to think about.
Yeah, there was definitely other settlements. I mean, Old Salem, that's one of those ones people really know about, but they're a German settlement. They're not really dealing with any of the sort of minutia of the day-to-day running of the colony of North Carolina underneath the British government. So that's where it's like, yeah, there were further west towns. Like, I don't want to say that Hillsborough was sort of the last outpost, but it was in terms of like where people were actually going to be able to do things like pay their taxes or have their court cases heard or those kinds of things. You would have to travel into Hillsborough for that, even if you were living out in the mountains. So it becomes a pretty important spot.
What was happening in the rest of the colonies, like big picture?
Yeah. So, I mean, as we're coming up on sort of Hillsborough playing this major role, you have other things that are starting to go on, some unrest that's happening. The Boston Massacre is a big one that I feel like we all know about. I feel like sometimes people don't realize how early it was. It actually happened in March of 1770, which is about 6 years before the Declaration of Independence itself is signed. And of course, the Declaration of Independence is just sort of a starting point or one of the stepping stones. So it's certainly important to celebrate it as a 250th anniversary, but our Constitution doesn't end up getting signed until, the 1780s. So the Boston Massacre being that first big one, the Boston Tea Party happens 3 years later. And then actually before anything even really kicked off in Hillsborough, you have Lexington and Concord, which is the first sort of shots of the Civil War fired in April of 1775. And that really sets the stage for, okay, what is this tension that's kind of coming up in Hillsborough? It's not just North Carolina. It's not, North Carolina isn't necessarily the hotbed of any kind of dissension, but it's also not necessarily sort of the absence of it or anything like that. It's also not just sort of existing without any conflict. So, yeah.
How did news travel? I mean, I know what it's like today, right? And
yeah.
I don't know who you trust or what's real and what's not. Now, go back to the 1700s. I mean, there's a lot of emotion in what's to come, and you're going to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, how did they get that information?
Yeah, a lot of it was centered on newspapers. So you had different newspapers that were circling around. A lot of times that was sort of major newspapers were settled in, again, those port areas. So you'd have some in Boston, you'd have them over in on the coast in New Bern and Wilmington, places like that, basically places where people are coalescing and doing trade. Then those would have sort of made their way into places like Hillsborough, sort of at a snail's pace. I mean, it really is as fast as a carriage can travel, or maybe if you're lucky, one person on horseback. Hillsborough being as sort of central to the government system as it was, they may have gotten a little bit of faster news than, somewhere like outposts of South Carolina or even as far as Tennessee, just because there would have been a little bit of priority in getting them updated news to be able to make their case. But really, I mean, things kind of traveled. It could take you months to learn about something that's happening up in Boston. Local news is definitely what kind of rules the day, and word of mouth. I mean, again, these small subsistence farmers, some of them would have been able to do small sums, small figures, enough to keep their books and sort of keep their accounts, but most of them wouldn't have been able to sort of sit down and read an actual newspaper. And it sort of becomes, I know we'll talk a little bit about the regulators, literacy and like control of the media sort of becomes a major player in it, because the colonial officials who are very much against the regulators are the ones who have control of the newspapers and who have control of like the accounts. There's almost nothing that we have written in the regulators' own words that survives even today to sort of offer a counterpoint. So kind of a fascinating with the folks who work at the Alamance Battleground State Historic Site. They have a lot of trouble with the fact that we really only have kind of a one-sided narrative, because that's all the news was sharing at the time.
Well, let's talk about the regulators. Yeah. Who were they, and what were they focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the regulators were sort of mostly those small subsistence farmers living outside of the town of Hillsborough. You wouldn't have really found a regulator in town except for when they were kind of coming in to pay their taxes, or as the Regulator Movement, the Regulator Rebellion. It's kind of known by a couple different names depending on what side of the aisle you're sitting on at the time. They are coming into Hillsborough to also just sort of protest corrupt officials who are often living in Hillsborough themselves. So a lot of the folks who are regulators, they're meeting up in what is today Alamance County, but would have been Orange County at the time. So the Cane Creek Assembly, which is a Quaker society in Snow Camp, which is over in Alamance, that was kind of a main meeting place for folks to sort of gather and chat with one another about what was going on. But again, Hillsborough is the spot that they come to whenever they are sort of needing things government-wise. So the big issue that the regulators are having at the time is that they're being told to pay their taxes, which was not quite so simple at the time. A lot of the sort of backcountry or farther west operated on sort of a barter subsistence economy. So I might come to you and say, hey, I need a bag of flour. Can I trade you these 10 eggs? Well, Well, you can't exactly come into Hillsborough and say, well, I'm going to give the king these 10 eggs to pay for my taxes at the time. That's where you get things like cash crops like tobacco and cotton. There were actually warehouses that had set schedules of how you could transfer those items to each other or for actual cash, so pounds, shillings, that you could then use to go and pay your taxes. But the closest of those warehouses that were regulated by the government were all the way out in, I think the closest one would be in sort of Johnston County today. So quite a ways away from where a lot of these people are living and working. So instead, that responsibility to transfer things over, to get actual physical cash into the hands of the people to pay their taxes sort of falls onto the officials, most of whom were living in Hillsborough at the time. As you can imagine, being kind of far away from the coast, that sort of opens up opportunities to make...
But she's thinking for a nice way to say it.
Suspicious things. I'm trying to make this sound nice. Kind of gives you the opportunity to stick your hands in the pot a little bit. Edmund Fanning, who I mentioned before, he's sort of known as like the right hand of Tryon. He is like particularly well known for this, of sort of either shorting people on their taxes, or once they come to town and they're not able to pay their taxes, taking over their land, their homes, their livestock, and sort of seizing them as a form of payment. Fanning himself owns like 7 different lots in prime downtown Hillsborough, is like building all of these houses, very similar to Governor Tryon, who's being protested at the time for building Tryon's palace, seen as this symbol of government excess, of like taxing.
Even back then,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, seen as sort of
things never change.
Yeah, this giant building of like just sort of a symbol. So, again, as they're coming into Hillsborough, you have folks like Fanning, and they're coming to the court systems to sort of try to be heard and have these sort of losses and this corruption addressed.
See, I thought of the Regulators. I was thinking dark, evil music. I thought they were bad people just based on the name. But
yeah.
I mean, I bet there's a lot of people today that could absolutely identify with those folks.
Yeah,
they had legit reasons.
Yeah, I think so. It's a kind of interesting... when you look at the Regulators and sort of what they're asking for, it's actually much more akin to sort of what we think of the ideals of like the American Revolution. They're sort of asking for just being left alone on their land, to be able to be dealt fairly with the government, for transparency and government things, which I think is kind of things that we all want and sort of expect. But I think it's kind of fascinating because the folks who are sort of anti-regulator, who are the ones that are living in town, they're really the ones that become the revolutionaries later on in Hillsborough, which I think is kind of a flip from a narrative that we would normally expect.
Yeah,
Francis Nash himself, who I talked about, he later becomes this big fighter in the American Revolution. He literally was at Tryon's side as he's going against the Regulators and the Battle of Alamance. So he is incredibly anti-regulator, which is, again, not the typical narrative that you would expect for this sort of pre-revolution activity.
Do you think it inspired them in some way to think about change, or to think about the power they had?
I think it had to have made them think about the power that they had. And I think it had to have been in the back of their minds, sort of, especially as we continue moving in the story and we're looking at, okay, so what does independence look like? What is setting up a sort of, fair government that is addressing all people? How do we do that? But I think at the same time, a lot of revolutionary leaders, where it's maybe not as much of a revolution as we think, they're still really invested in not necessarily turning over the power of the vote to all people. They very much restrict themselves to, you have to be male, that's first and foremost, but also that, you have to own some form of land. If you're a renter, you don't get a vote in this day and age. And more than that, to be able to be in a seat of power, you have to have 100 acres of land, which is a fairly significant amount even back then, in order to, be a person who is eligible to be a part of the state government or to be a senator. So I do think that there's a level to which they are thinking about, a few years later, they're thinking about these people, thinking about their needs, thinking about how do we address them. But at the same time, even, 6 years down the line, they're not necessarily wanting to give people like the Regulators a ton of political power or a ton of political say.
Things have not changed that much.
Again, yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah. It sounds like they're doing it more out of selfishness for themselves, protecting their own power base. And at some point they must realized that, well, you're going to have to appease if you can't defeat. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way that it.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's you have to have compromises.
But they were on board with breaking away from Britain.
Yeah.
That's what blows me away.
Yeah, and so the regulators themselves, it's really interesting. A lot of them are not revolutionaries. They're actually very much loyalists on the side of Great Britain because they sort of want this higher manager, this higher up that they can go to, because that's sort of what happens with the Regulator Movement eventually. They initially try to protest in these small courts. Hillsborough is the site of a riot in 1770, and then hangings of regulators in 1771. But the ultimate goal was to sort of get King George himself or the House of Burgesses in England. It was to get them to pay attention to the things that were happening and to sort of give the colonial officials a slap on the wrist. So the hierarchy of power would be the local officials, Governor Tryon himself, who clearly also is not on the side of the regulators,
right.
House of Burgesses, and then up to King George. It's really fascinating with the Regulator Movement that Samuel Johnston, who sort of becomes the president of this Congress that's held in Hillsborough later on, he actually is the one to author what's called the Johnston Riot Act at the time, which it retroactively criminalizes anyone who participated in the Hillsborough riot. So those regulators who were coming in asking for their cases to be heard, they weren't doing anything illegal. But Johnston, who becomes a revolutionary leader later on, literally says, we need to make sure that this was criminalized and that we can go back and prosecute these people. Not even giving people a chance to decide whether they're going to participate in a legal activity or not. You're sort of telling them that they were a criminal. Mm-hmm. That law that he actually puts into place and is passed through the North Carolina Assembly at the time actually ends up going all the way to King George III, and he overturns it himself, saying that it was not in line with the type of rule and was not respectful of the rights that colonists have. So again, you have kind of this fascinating interplay of like regulators don't necessarily trust the people who become these revolutionaries and who sort of want to run their own government because they're worried about not having somebody else to go to.
Wouldn't you? I mean, you can see where they would become.
Well, they're focused on, or it sounds like they're focused on farming and they're trying to make their money. They
just
or
want
whatever.
a fair shot.
Well, and they don't necessarily, I think what they really want is just to be able to either have somebody that they can trust that's in office or to be able to have, that choice for themselves. But at the time, this idea of democracy and of every man having a vote, and a lot of the regulators, I mean, before it was seized for taxes, they do own land. They do have some sort of property and therefore would have been able to vote, at least for the state level assemblies when the Constitution is put into place. But democracy, I mean, it was a brand new experiment. That was sort of unthinkable at the time. So they're thinking, well, we're not trading, we're not trading this kingship that has power over us and is deciding things for us for something where we can decide ourselves. What they're thinking at the time is that we're trading one king for another, and we know how this closer king, quote unquote, king would act. So I think that that's more along the lines of how they would be sort of looking at it, not even sort of daring to dream that they would be able to have any sort of political power, because that's not the world that they had come from.
Well,
I don't know if I'd be a regulator or one of the other guys. I mean, I'm becoming very sympathetic to the regulators.
We're going to, obviously, we'll all dress up.
Yeah.
And we'll see who you are.
I've always wanted to wear a wig, and now more so than ever, so I might go with the other guys.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I mean, I did not know that perspective until now.
It's really interesting.
It's fascinating, it really is.
It's a much more complicated history, I think, than people necessarily realize.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think change, it just seems like change, it's obvious when you think about it now, with social media and everything, the speed of change, and then kind of when you pull that back, the speed of change and revolution and kind of coming up with the idea, I think, a long time to come together. And well, let's talk about the Third Provincial Congress, because I think it was what is it, and why did it meet in Hillsborough?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Third Provincial Congress was a meeting that took place in August of 1775, August 20th to about September 10th. It happens in the church in Hillsborough, which would have been the public meeting space. It was an Anglican church, which was the Church of England. So they're actually maintained by state taxes at the time and therefore able to be used for sort of these public purposes. It's a collection of folks, 213 delegates from all 35 counties at the time, who sort of come together and are beginning to take their real first steps towards independence. It's the Third Provincial Congress, because there were two beforehand. But those ones were just a little bit more, we were really following Virginia in saying, like, we affirm that we want to be a part of Great Britain, but, what you're doing up in Boston is not okay. And then when Great Britain continues to occupy Boston and continues to kind of do these things, saying instead, we're going to start boycotting things like paper and stamps and things like that. The Third Provincial Congress, when they come to Hillsborough, is really the moment that they start to really, really take those steps towards independence, which is important. So you have 6 military districts that are established. The provincial congresses were established after May of 1775, when Josiah Martin, who was the colonial governor that followed Governor Tryon, he has fled the colony by May of 1775. He is in fear of his life. He has abandoned Tryon Palace. He is theoretically, he claims, ruling from like the Albemarle Sound, but you can imagine that that's not the most effective.
He's like the first working from home.
Exactly. Yeah. But he didn't have Zoom at the time. So the Provincial Congress is sort of what steps in as the leaders over the colony in Josiah Martin's absence. So again, important that they're kind of sitting here, they're meeting, they're the ones who are deciding on a state level, how are we responding to all of the things that are going on. So by the time that we've gotten to 1775, again, we've already had those first shots fired in Lexington and Concord. So we're at a really tense moment in sort of needing to decide, are we going to start moving towards independence, or are we going to continue to ask Great Britain to treat us fairly? Because that's really all the American Revolution was about. Initially, the goal was not to become a separate country. Initially, the goal was just sort of to reform the way that the government was acting towards us, which is very similar to how the Regulators were kind of moving, which I think is an interesting kind of line to draw. But at the Congress, they established 6 military districts. These are different zones that are going to be smaller ways of sort of governing. They are establishing their own form of currency, which is really cool. We have one of those pieces of currency is still at the Orange County Historical Museum, so still in Hillsborough, where it was first issued, which is cool. And then last but not least, they are making arrangements for manufacturing, things like weapons, paper, and cloth that are going to be necessary. So it's a little bit like if you're thinking of the American Revolution, I think in terms of a breakup, it's like, up until this point, it's been the fighting, the squabbling, but you're making up the next day, or at the very least, you're deciding to keep going. This is like kind of like America deciding that they're going to pull their suitcase out and maybe set a Google alert for flights, or even booking like a refundable ticket at this point of like, okay, we're like really being serious about this breakup.
But you haven't cleaned out the checking account yet, right?
Right, exactly.
You haven't done that yet.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Right. It's still the toothbrush is on the counter, but it's like, okay, maybe some of my other things I'm starting to sort of gather up and place into a new area, so that it's a grab and go type of thing. So
honor what matters most with a flag that makes a statement. From celebrating milestones to paying tribute to veterans, Carrot Top helps you find the perfect flag for every occasion. Explore our collection today at carrot-top.com.
Did they realize at that time the danger they were putting themselves and their family in? I mean, this was no insignificant thing. I mean, Britain was powerful.
Yeah,
they could crush them.
That's really what Boston kind of showed. I think Boston really was sort of that initial kind of hotbed of showing exactly how far the British government was willing to go when they were pushed, and also sort of showing how far the American colonists were willing to go in terms of protesting things that they felt was unfair. I mean, that's exactly what the Boston Tea Party sort of is. It's everybody throwing boxes of tea into the harbor to protest having to pay additional import taxes on it. And so I do think that at this point in time, the folks who are showing up to this meeting they are fully aware of just how dangerous this is. And it's part of why they choose Hillsborough as the actual site that they're going to. The first 2 provincial congresses were held in New Bern, which was the colonial capital of the time, where Tryon Palace is. It's right on the coast, so it's easy for British ships to get in. Hillsborough, again, it's much further west. It's going to take at least a few days of travel over land, which is much slower than water travel. So theoretically, it would give the folks who are part of this provincial congress a little bit of extra time should they need to sort of flee any oncoming British troops. So part of it, again, was that Hillsborough is already set up. It's already kind of has the makings of being this important place. It has the facilities to be able to house 213 additional men along with their families and their servants and the folks that they have enslaved. But it's also just far enough away that they're sort of at least a little bit out of the reach of power for the time being and able to have these kind of difficult conversations.
You know, what's interesting, we're so used to everything happening like yesterday, right?
Yeah.
Time really was a big factor, and it played in favor, I think, of those folks versus Britain, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
They used it. They were smart to use it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, I think they knew, having the Third Provincial Congress, knowing that this is going to be taking a longer step, that was something that took longer. The first 2 congresses, they take about 3 or 4 days.
Right.
It's really just, again, kind of signing off on things that other folks had already written, sort of the sentiments that are already happening. But the Third Provincial Congress, this is really the first time that they have to start, kind of compromising and having real discussions on, okay, what does this look like? Like, who is running these military districts? What is our currency backed by? Who is in charge of setting up these manufacturing facilities? What are these manufacturing facilities going to sort of create? And once they create weaponry and paper, how are we moving that? And that's something that they know they're going to need time to be able to have those sort of hard conversations on. It's not something that, you can just sort of sit down and all agree on. You're all going to have different opinions. So again, choosing Hillsborough and giving themselves that time for forces to be able to travel to them, but also that time for them to know that they have sort of a safe place, or as safe of a place as they can get to discuss and kind of have these conversations. That's, incredibly important for the eventual outcome and that movement towards independence.
Who's able to set aside their job for a month? I don't know. And these people must have been badass, right? That they're willing to. I'm sure there was recorded, who was there and who are these people? Yeah.
So a lot of them, they were politicians. So a lot of them were involved in the colonial government structures. They were, clerks or sort of representatives at the time. So they are still doing their job. It's just, kind of the question of is Britain going to still be paying my paycheck, or am I deferring this to some future form of government? But in the room at the Third Provincial Congress, you have a lot of important folks. One, Samuel Johnston, the one that I mentioned before, author of the Johnston Riot Act. He's the president of the Congress, and so he's officially the highest ranking person in all of North Carolina at the time. He was sort of Josiah Martin's second in the sort of colonial power structure. And so he kind of becomes the natural choice for, okay, who's going to lead us in Martin's absence. You have the 1st through 7th governors, future governors of North Carolina that are in the room, names like Richard Caswell, Alexander Martin, Benjamin Williams, Samuel Ashe, Thomas Burke, and Abner Nash. And some of those are counties that we know of today, Caswell and Nash especially. You have all 3 signers from North Carolina who go on to sign the Declaration of Independence. You can sort of imagine that they're probably the firebrands in the room, really advocating for us to take those more and more steps. Those are William Hooper, James Penn, Joseph Hughes, and then we also have some folks who just are major military players. Francis Nash, who I mentioned, who's from Hillsborough and has the pleasure of sort of walking a block over to, or not even a block over, just a few steps down to sort of this meeting place. Robert Howe, the only major general from North Carolina, and also Nathaniel Rochester, who was sort of an important player at the time and goes on to found Rochester, New York after he leaves Hillsborough. So there were a lot of folks who were kind of again, like they're politicians. Like it is a dangerous job, and it is them not getting paid, and they really are putting their lives on the line. But it's also work that they are sort of well versed in. Like they know the political conversations that are happening at the time. They're aware of sort of these philosophical musings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and they're also tried and tested of that. They know what the actual day-to-day work is that goes into running a colony. And so again, thinking about the regulators, they are having more of that perspective of how do we create something that's going to effectively govern all of these different people that we're now responsible for. So those are kind of the different folks who are in the room. It was quite a cast of characters. I can only imagine little tiny Hillsborough having all of these, these 200 very influential men sort of all of a sudden descending. It's one of the things I think about a lot. Like that must have just been we're in the World Cup right now, so it kind of, I guess, maybe feels a little bit like that, where it's like all of a sudden town is just sort of overrun by all these people who are not normally in this area and sort of all have this one goal, and there's sort of this excitement and this fervor about, what are we doing in this important decision that they're making. So.
Well, you mentioned a lot of these people went on to become pretty prominent.
Yeah.
A lot of other people, as they got involved in this, are either forgotten or maybe had very negative complications from this. So how were they able to come out of this Congress? They had to be somewhat united themselves, but they had to unite the regulators and everybody else, I would think, to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what happened after that? The Congress is done. They decided they're going to do what they're going to do. That was really the beginning, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it was this, again, sort of the stepping stone. What ends up going on, and they sort of have the benefit as they go on of their sort of a rallying moment for all of North Carolina that brings them together. So February 1776, so just a few months after the Congress has closed, we get the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. That's the first and kind of only really highly significant revolutionary battle that takes place in North Carolina. There are a few others, but none that are quite so much of a firebrand to the community as the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge is. In it, you have this Scottish regiment that goes up against the British and are just sort of absolutely slaughtered. I mean, it is like it's a bloodbath, and it really quells a lot of Loyalist sentiment in North Carolina. It really kind of brings people together, showing that, the British government doesn't necessarily have their best interests at heart and is willing to spill blood in order to keep them in the colony. So if we sort of compare it to the Boston Massacre, maybe the thing that like incited Bostonians to understand just how serious the British government was, that's exactly what the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge is for North Carolinians. And of course, there are still Loyalists. They still are in and around North Carolina, but that's really the thing that kind of lightning rods to bring the whole community together.
See, that's interesting you say that. I would think too, I'm guessing the Brits were probably thinking it would have the opposite effect.
Yeah, they definitely.
And it didn't.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're thinking about it again, comparing back to the Regulator Movement, you have the Battle of Alamance, which is also sort of this one day, one battle up against these small farmers, and it's British forces that are going up against them and trying to quell rebellion. The Battle of Alamance is the end for the Regulator Movement. There really isn't, it does its job. It shows the power of the crown. It shows how far they're willing to go, and it sort of ends it. So for the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge, it again just shows you, 6 years down the line, how much has changed for these people that are living in America. And I think too, just how far like Great Britain had pushed people to like be willing to sort of take the step into the unknown. That's where you sort of, after that battle, that's when April 12th, we get our Halifax Resolves, which are kind of our first step into like really declaring independence. The Mecklenburg Declaration happens before that, but that is a sticky subject all on its own, so I will not trod on that as a historian, because there are people who are far more educated that have better opinions than I do. But April 12th, 1776, that Halifax Resolves, that's sort of our precursor to actually taking for North Carolina independence, and that's sort of what sets us up to send people to the Continental Congresses, which is where the Declaration of Independence itself sort of gets signed. So We definitely couldn't have gotten to that step though without Hillsborough. And I think again, it's really significant that Hillsborough was the place that was chosen, and it wasn't done willy-nilly. It was very intentionally chosen as the place for some of these precursor conversations to happen, and to sort of allow this swift action. I mean, February to April, that's a pretty short amount of time to go from a major battle to sort of declaring a form of independence. And you couldn't have done that without sort of the pre-planning that happens at the Hillsborough Third Provincial Congress.
I'm coming out of this feeling very important.
Hillsborough is so important.
Look what we did.
Yeah.
I wonder how many of us would do it today. I mean, seriously, I mean, imagine what it must have been, the conversations that must have been had by husband and wives and families all throughout North Carolina going, you're doing what? And what that really actually meant.
Yeah.
You know, because, man, that would have been frightening, I think, for a lot of people. And the fact that they weren't frightened off is a true testament to the people here.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think
And I'm sure you would have been one that would not have been frightened.
Well, and I think that's sort of why, like, the American Revolution, I think we have this concept that, you know, we sort of just all, that's why I think the Boston Massacre, talking about how much earlier it was, it's kind of important because you think that we just sort of went from the Boston Massacre to the Boston Tea Party to Lexington and Concord to, okay, we're independent now. But it really was like a highly negotiated thing. There was really an attempt to sort of reconcile with Great Britain and to get at least representation. I mean, that's no taxation without representation. The first thing that we're asking for is not to be independent. The first thing that we're asking for is to be represented, to have a voice. It's only when that clearly becomes a non-starter that we really have people who sort of have the harebrained idea to peel off and to create not only our own nation, which had been done before, but this entirely new form of government that, you know, hasn't been seen since ancient Rome. So that's sort of the I guess, sticking point, I guess, of where the first, you know, William Hooper, James Penn, Joseph Hughes, the ones who are sort of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and are willing to put pen to paper on this, like, truly, like, revolutionary document. They're the ones who are, like, really sticking their necks out, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they did.
Yeah,
Many
absolutely.
Didn't end well for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you're a fabulous storyteller. I really appreciate you.
I would have passed history.
If she had. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, just keep explaining everything.
Yes, it's just amazing.
Yeah,
and I do. I feel I'm not homegrown here. I'm a transplant, but I you know, my chest is puffing out a bit.
Yeah. Well,
remarkable story.
They do walking tours at the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough.
Yes. Yeah. And our tour guides are fantastic. Every Saturday, 10:30. Sorry, not 10 a.m. It's every Saturday at 10:30. Our guides are going out and they sort of go over all of this history and sort of where Hillsborough went next, because we definitely don't stop with the American Revolution. We continue to have important roles in the Civil War, in sort of the Industrial Revolution as it comes to the South post-Civil War, and we create mills and things like that. And we're still I would like to think we're still a pretty cool town today, still kind of making waves, and it's always a good place to visit. But we do love our history and keep it front of mind.
Yeah. Well, you also tell us about the event coming up in the fall.
Yeah. So we have our
exciting.
Outlandish Hillsborough Scottish Festival. That's based on the TV series and book series Outlander, written by Diana Gabaldon. It's actually tied into the Regulator Movement and to the American Revolution, I guess, technically, since Jamie Fraser, our main character, is actually forced by Governor Tryon to sort of join his militia and to march against the Regulators, which is sort of counter to what you would think Jamie would be doing, because he's a small farmer himself, sort of having this subsistence thing. But Jamie and Claire sort of get drawn into the Regulators, and as do their daughter and things like that. But in September, we gather up at Airmount, which is a 1815 home built by a Scottish merchant named William Kirkland. And we have a big festival that just sort of celebrates Hillsborough's Scottish history, our connection to the Outlander series, and a lot of like sort of this revolutionary, regulator, colonial milieu that like Jamie and Claire sort of find themselves in. You're talking about you would have paid attention in history class or had fun in history class. I think that's sort of the power of things like the Outlander series. People learn about these events and the complicated histories around them in a way that's fun. And that's definitely what we try to do at the Outlandish Hillsborough Scottish Festival. We have our speakers tent where you can learn a little bit, but we also have our whiskey tastings and our bagpipers and dancing and all of that good stuff too. So try to make it a little bit of history with a lot of fun on the side, I think.
See? A lot of fun would have gone a long way.
Absolutely.
No, I agree.
The whiskey tasting is great.
Yes.
It's my favorite part.
Okay. I may get to put a wig on after all. After a little whiskey.
I love it.
Yeah.
Before we close, would you be willing to stick around for a Flags of Change segment?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Well,
Awesome.
Kelly actually recommended that we talk about the flag of the Society of the Cincinnati, which I personally had never heard of. So in this segment, just to tee it up, we pick a flag and we follow it back to where it came from and the people, behind the movement. And so this flag, I think, comes from right down the road. Mm-hmm. It's founded by officers of the Revolution who went back to ordinary life when the war ended.
Yes.
And I guess there's a North Carolina chapter in Hillsborough that's still around.
Yeah.
And so Kelly's going to tell us, a little bit about, I guess, start with what is the Society of the Cincinnati?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Society of the Cincinnati, it was sort of a fraternal organization. So I'm a descendant of it, but technically not allowed in it because of that pesky X chromosome. But the Society of the Cincinnati was founded by officers of the Continental Army. So they would have been folks who were commissioned officers in the Continental Line. So not just standard run-of-the-mill soldiers, somebody who had a little bit of power in it. It's originally started, the very first chapter is created by Henry Knox. And George Washington serves as sort of the first president of it, alongside the Marquis de Lafayette, our French revolutionary who sort of comes to our aid. But that's founded up in Newburgh, New York in May of 1783. And quickly, sort of other chapters are founded in all of the original 13 colonies. And then the addition of France, the Marquis de Lafayette goes on and creates his own chapter to sort of acknowledge the officers who served in the Continental Line on our behalf. So in Hillsborough, on October 3rd of 1783, many of the North Carolina officers gather at James Hoag's cabin, which is sort of up on the hill, actually right near the Regulator marker in town today. And they put together the first version of the North Carolina chapter of the society. So they kind of come together and create this organization. James Hoag was a big, and that's H-O-G-G. Sometimes it's spelled as Hog. His kids later changed their name. I wonder why, because you could maybe imagine the schoolyard taunts that come from having Hog as your last name. But James Hoag was a trader. He was a merchant and sort of was one of the founding trustees of UNC. So in addition to his role of founding the Society of Cincinnati, he's sort of a big player on the stage as well.
What was their mission? Like, what were they hoping to?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally the Society of the Cincinnati, they had the main goal of the organization is to perpetuate the memory of the American Revolution, right? They're trying to keep in mind, why did we fight for this independence? Because that's sort of important as you go forward. They're also trying to keep those bonds in between the officers, just sort of like acknowledging that they went through this thing together and becoming a social organization with them to sort of keep up friendships and all of those good things. Promoting the ideals of the revolution was another big one. And then what I think is probably like the most important is that they actually set up systems to provide for families in need. So most often these are veterans who are disabled, who need medical care. It's also the wives and the children who are left behind by the folks who don't make it through the revolution. There's a particular focus on like the officers' wives, since that's sort of the the goal of this chapter, but they really become sort of a mutual aid society, ensuring that these women and children who are left behind and are sort of orphaned and widowed by the war are able to continue living and don't sort of fall into destitution. So those are sort of the main things. And then nowadays, they mostly support educational efforts. Again, that kind of idea of keeping the memory of the American Revolution alive, the ideals of independence. That's more of the focus, creating educational materials, preserving important items from the American Revolution, and then also just making sure that education gets to people out in the world, and especially school children. I mean, that's the easiest place to sort of catch people and introduce them to kind of this story. So they're having a banner year this year with it being the 250th.
I bet.
God bless them for that. Trust me, public education history classes have changed a lot.
Absolutely,
and,
absolutely.
This, like a session like this, you should go in if you have and teach kids about this. They'd be fascinated. They'd learn so much more.
Yeah.
And I don't know it. I think the further we get away from anything, right?
Yeah,
we tend to
absolutely.
forget.
Yeah.
And it's too important to forget.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the flag, though?
Yeah.
Is it a bottle of whiskey?
No, it's not
No.
a bottle of
What's
whiskey,
the
not
flag?
a bottle of whiskey. So the flag, it's 13 stripes for the 13 colonies, so just like the U.S. flag, but it's in blue and white. It's like kind of a light, almost like Tar Heel blue, of course. Yes. I don't think that's why they picked it to be that color, but it's initially... The idea was that it was representing the allegiance of America and France. Rather than having 13 stars, though, it actually has 14 stars. So that's each of the original colonies and then that French chapter that gets added on. Sort of a funny story. I was talking to my dad because it was Father's Day this past weekend and asking him if he knew anything about the flag since he's a part of the society, the Cincinnati. And he told me that a few years ago, he was looking at our flag that was hanging off of our porch and he was counting the stars. And he's like, there's the wrong number of stars on that flag. And there were 13 rather than 14. So there are a couple society flags running out around there.
Fraudulent.
Yeah, just because 13 stars is what you would expect to see from flags of the time period. 14 is kind of an odd one. We don't see that super often. So now there's the correct flags that are sort of running around. But my dad, I felt like I owed it to him to share that he was the one that sort of was staring at the flag enough to be able to figure that one out from whoever was, I know it wasn't you guys producing it, but whoever was producing it at the time.
Trying to save a buck. Right?
Yeah, I know.
They won't notice it.
It's not quite as aesthetically pleasing, too, because like with 14, it's like...
Yeah, it's a little off.
It's a little off.
Yeah.
It's a little off. But yeah, and then the last thing that's on the flag is the eagle, the society's insignia. It's designed by Charles Pierre L'Enfant, who also designed and laid out Washington, D.C. That's sort of where most people will know him from. There's a D.C. metro station that's named after him. But he creates the American, it's an American bald eagle, and it has the ancient Roman hero Cincinnatus. So that would be Lucius Quintus Cincinnatus. He was sort of this figure known for becoming one of the dictators of Rome and then sort of deciding that he is going to give up his power, give up the sword, and instead take up his farming implements once again. So George Washington, because he steps down from being the president after 2 terms and decides to head back to Mount Vernon, head back to his farm, he's known as the American Cincinnatus. This is sort of the like lore behind the Society of the Cincinnati and sort of the thing that they praise. So the whole point of the Society of the Cincinnati is these officers turning away from wartime and turning into peace, becoming people who are providing for their communities, which I think is a beautiful sentiment. But yeah, the eagle itself, you'll notice it has downturned wings, again, not like taking off in flight, and an olive branch, a literal representation of peace, in addition to that little depiction of Cincinnatus. So it's said to emphasize the founding of a peaceful American republic and the return of its soldiers to their citizen lives.
Nice. Can anybody join, or is it open to just descendants?
It's open to just descendants, so it's one of the more like
very exclusive.
Yeah,
and
it's
male,
one of the more
sounds
yes,
like
only
male
men, male descendants.
Now know how a woman feels.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
I'm excluded.
Excluded. There are some
You
honorary.
might be a descendant. You don't know.
That is true.
Well, that's true.
It's true.
It's true. Okay.
Ancestry.com.
Yeah. There are also honorary members that are appointed. There's quite a few different.
Wait, sneak in?
Yeah. There's if you were to become the president of the United States, usually they're pretty eligible for an honorary membership. So, that's a pretty easy one to attain.
Well, it sounds like they do wonderful work, though. The whole premise of it is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for
thank you.
educating us on multiple things, and thank you for the work you do with the Alliance.
Absolutely.
And, this
Hopefully
was a real treat.
Yeah, it really was. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see y'all at the whiskey tasting table in
absolutely.
September.
Thanks for listening to Freedom and Glory, Tales of American Spirit. If today's story moved you, share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Subscribe and leave a review. It helps others find us. And when you're ready for American-made flags and products built to last, visit freedomandglory.com. One flag, a million stories, yours included.